Liberal ministers out today to argue that if Pierre Poilievre is willing to use the notwithstanding clause on crime, which is something the Tory leader said last week, he could also use it on reproductive rights. His office was quick to reject that suggestion today, writing in a statement in part, "These outlandish claims show the true desperation of Justin Trudeau and his flailing Liberals. A common-sense Conservative government will not legislate on abortion and therefore would never use this section of the Constitution pertaining to this matter." The statement goes on to say, "We know that Minister Ian enjoys conspiracy theories, but she should really stop spreading misinformation now that she's an honourable minister." The front bench is back to unpack this war of words, you could call it. Saeed Selvam, Shakir Chambers, Karl, Bélanger, and Marieke, Walsh. Marieke, look, a lot of this is fueled by reporting you did last week because Pierre Poilievre talked about the notwithstanding clause in relation to matters of crime. That generated, enough reaction as it was. You then went and asked the Tories, what else are you willing to use? Like, will you rule out using it elsewhere? They didn't tell you that initially. Then after you published your article, they told other reporters, actually, no, we're not going to use it on any of this. Is this sort of an expected reaction to that? Or is it as far a jump as the Tories say the Liberals are making?
I think it's expected in terms of the commentary they've given on the notwithstanding clause and reviving it that people are going to ask, how far will you go? I mean, I asked that question, so it's fair to think others would, and it is one of those things where you are just you're giving a new line of attack on an old issue. I do think on this case, the Conservatives have been very clear. Mr. Poilievre was clear in the leadership race, and they're reviving his statement now that they would not legislate on this. The Conservatives are the only ones the only party, in the House of Commons that allow caucus to have different views on abortion. The NDP and the Liberals don't allow that. You have to subscribe to a pro-choice position to be in the caucus. So it just speaks to the same fight they have, or the same challenge they have with every election. The difference is now the Liberals are reviving it a year and a half before the next election.
I think the argument, Karl, that they are attempting to put forth is that this is a slippery slope. Do you think that's an argument that will resonate with Canadians? It's one that they've made, not specific to the notwithstanding clause, but they have sort of talked about the prospect of women's reproductive rights being taken away by previous Conservative leaders, and it was a successful kind of wedge, and it landed with Canadians. Do you think will this time?
Well, I mean, every time you bring out that scarecrow of abortion, it does work with voters. It's worked time and time again. It worked against Andrew Scheer. It worked against Erin O'Toole, even though, in the case of O'Toole especially, he was very clear about not legislating on this. I mean, Conservatives have to defend themselves because they have members in their caucus who keep bringing it up. And as long as they keep bringing it up, it will be a wedge issue for the Liberals. Now, the notwithstanding clause, funny enough, that allows this possibility was brought in by the Liberal Party of Canada under Pierre Trudeau and Jean Chrétien. It's funny how that goes.
I'm sure the next thing Pierre Poilievre will do is stand up in the House and thank Pierre Elliott Trudeau for his ability to use the clause. Shakir, what are your thoughts on this? And do you think that the Conservatives would have anticipated, when they did raise the specter of using the notwithstanding clause, that Liberals would ultimately go down this road? And to Karl's point, there are members who do talk about it, who bring in petitions, for example. But at the same time, Pierre Poilievre, to Marieka's point, has been, in this statement was explicit. I'm not going to legislate on it.
Yeah, I think the abortion thing, you always think it's going to come up at some point. But to what Marieke said earlier, usually this happens around election time. This is especially early to be talking about abortion and Conservative position around it. It just points to the fact that, they're really stuck in the polls and they're willing to try anything to kind of close that gap. But, Pierre has said he would never introduce legislation or pass legislation restricting abortion. He said he's pro freedom of choice, right? So these issues have kind of been put to rest, in my opinion. My general view is, the Liberals are pretty much creating problems that don't really exist. And I just kind of view it as, if they're talking about this, like, what don't they want to talk about? And I guess they don't want to talk about the back to work stuff, the cost of living, housing. You can name your issues. They're often very big in terms of talking about, the spread of misinformation and disinformation. And I think what they're talking about here is a lot of disinformation. So personally, I really wish they would practice what they preach, because Pierre has been very, very clear on this issue. And this is just, trying to wrap him up in a particular wedge issue that I don't think is going to work. I think Canadians kind of see through that, just like they see through this kind of far right stuff that the Liberals try to put out there as well. I don't think that stuff is going to work on Pierre.
That's it. I'm interested to think to hear, Saeed, what you think about that. I think as far as the timing goes, part of it is, my guess, trying to pick up on, Canadians consume a lot of American news and a lot of American content. And the threat of the loss of reproductive rights in the United States is a massive vote mover. And the midterm, the last election, all of that has underscored that point. And I think there exists a school of thought among the Liberals that that could essentially help inform the way in which Canadians react to the specter or the possibility of it happening here in this country.
It could. And unfortunately, when it comes to campaigns, especially given the fact that we're a year and a few months out from an election, fear mongering or fear of what somebody may or may not do can sometimes move results and move polls. And I'd say it would be more of a poll or vote mover if both Trudeau and Poilievre were close in the polls. But the issue is right now is that they're not. And Poilievre is so far ahead in the polls. So when it comes to trying to put something like this out there, for me, it seems like the Liberals are also trying to test messaging this far out. And when you try and test messaging, you're ideally trying to get a response from the public and trying to see whether or not this is something that's going to land. Is this something that the public is going to respond to in a very aggressive way, or they're just going to brush off because they're focused on other things? So by them putting this out there, it could just be a way of honestly testing it and testing the waters to see how it goes. But, Poilievre has come out, his team has come out, they've said pretty clearly that they would not do something like this. And when it comes to the use of the notwithstanding clause, so much has to be at play in order for it to be used. We're also assuming that Poilievre would win and win a majority government. The majority government would vote in favor of using the clause. So there are so many steps that have to be put into play in order for it to actually be used that the likelihood of it is just so low. And we as Canadians and in Canada tend to lean a little less right than our American counterparts. So rest assured, we can hopefully rely on that into the future.
The only thing about the notwithstanding clause, Marieke, is I gathered from the comments that Pierre Poilievre made last week, he was not trying to couch it in like, I'll rarely use this, it's going to be really hard to use it. He was saying, I'll use it at my will to address what I view as laws that do not work for Canadians. Like, that's a substantial comment to make.
Yeah, it was very personal. It was very much about what he would do as the prime minister. Now, I think it's important to remember the audience was the police association. It wasn't sort of a general audience. But yeah, I think that's in part why it got so much attention last week, because of the language and the sweeping nature in which he spoke about it. That's why we did those follow-up stories to try and get more understanding. I think what's interesting to me about this fight today is that the Liberals are trying to corner Pierre Poilievre on an issue that has won them in other cases. But Pierre Poilievre, to this point so far, it could change. The whole success of him has been to force them to argue on his turf, not for him to argue on their turf. So I'm very curious to see if this actually does shift the needle at all in terms of that dynamic. It a little bit feels like the Liberals are fighting new, with very old sort of lines that we've seen many times before, but they've worked before. So my question is, do they now?
To Saeed's point, though, Karl, they've worked when there wasn't this big of a gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives, which leads me to also kind of think, based on conversations, I'm not sure they look at it as a vote mover in the immediacy. I think they're trying over time to build a perception of Poilievre that they failed to build when he was putting ads out about who he was last summer. Like, they left that vacuum. Now they're trying to fill it and maybe create over time a perception. But to Marieka's point, like, who knows if that works?
Yeah, I mean, fear is a great motivator in politics. And so they're trying to build their case that this guy is scary. And if it's not this guy, it's the guys and the gals standing behind him. And they're going to point to every little bit to say, oh, hidden agenda. They're not telling you, but look what's happening down south. It's happening there. It's happening here. And you know that the so-called pro-life movement are intervening at nomination levels and are putting their people in there. And so it's a real possibility that it could happen, even though Poilievre says it won't happen. I'm sure that the Poilievre government wouldn't do it. But there are people who are building the case, that the Liberals can play with. And I think that's what's happening. Now, the reason why they're doing it so early, I think, is because that gap is so wide. So if they wait for the election, you won't move that 20% point in 3 weeks. Like, you need to start moving that gap now, or else they won't be able to reverse that trend.
They might also need to execute on some of their own policies, like contraceptives, for example, to really be able to land the attack they're trying to make today. because they haven't
good
said
point.
when that will roll out. The budget shows maybe 2027.
Yeah, the budget shows a money spread over a long 5-year period of time, I think. So yeah, that's a very good point to make. Okay, I'm going to leave our conversation there. Thanks everyone. Thanks to our front bench, Saeed Selvam, Shakir Chambers, Marieke Walsh, and Karl Bélanger. Our takeaway is next.